So another week, another Ask Me Anything webinar. And this week we have James Nau. If you don't know who James Nau is, he's kind of a big deal. He's VP of Design at a startup in Australia called Airtasker. Like Uber, but getting chores done on a daily basis. James has participated for a Q&A with my UX cohort last year, and everybody loves him. So here it is, it's back. Let's bring it on, James.
Hello. Thank you everyone for having me. I'm super humbled to see everyone here today. Yeah. For anyone that doesn't know who I am, I'm James. I'm the VP of Design at Airtasker, which I am aware is probably not that well known outside of Australia. But we are an online marketplace, so we look to connect people who want to get things done with the people who want to find work. And so our mission at Airtasker is to empower everyone to realize the full power of their skills. And yeah, it's a mission that I'm incredibly happy to be a part of. We've recently IPO'd, so hopefully you'll see us out there in the global world shortly enough.
Yay! And and I'm proud to announce I'm a proud investor, just a little bit, not too much. Okay, so who want to have the first burning question throw at James today? Yeah, Mike, I know. I was looking at you just then.
I thought you would too, actually.
Well, Jacqueline, I must confess, I have some history with James before, so but I didn't want to hijack your call. So, but I'll just ask you how have things changed after the IPO? I just want to know a bit more about that.
Yeah, interesting. I think realistically, it hasn't changed a hell of a lot. So Airtasker is about 10 years old now. We IPO'd maybe a month ago, and it was a whirlwind of an experience. I think I've been at Airtasker for now over 3 years, and to see the transition between Airtasker as a startup to a scale up now, the biggest change has been maturity. You can get away with a lot, I think, as a startup. Internally, as a leadership team, as a business, you can always give yourself an excuse that it didn't quite work out because you're a startup. And I think once you IPO and the world is kind of starting to look at you start to realize actually, like, we need to be accountable to a lot of these decisions and a lot of the actions that we're making. And I think that's the biggest difference. It's the maturity, and I actually love it. I think as an organization, you want to see yourself kind of keep stepping it up and keep improving. I think the IPO is probably just a natural way for us to kind of get closer and closer to where we want to be as a business. But the mission hasn't changed, and I don't think anything would change the mission. And I think that's the beauty of Airtasker, and that's the beauty of why we love working here, is because even with so much going on, we're not going to make the wrong decisions. We're always going to be focused on customers first and making sure that we are able to generate income for those who want to work, and we want to help the people who want to get things done. So overall, yeah, not that much change. Although I feel busier. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but that's definitely a normal change, I feel.
Awesome. Thanks, buddy.
Oh, do you know you guys have some histories? How fun. What a small world. Right. So James, me and you had brief conversations before this. I mean, we haven't met in person, but I've had the privilege to have James to join my class last year for some Q&A. And I can tell you guys, everyone, out of the 4 or 5 people I've invited, James was everyone's like top favorite. So if you don't ask questions today, you're missing out. So please just get it out. But if no one has a question, maybe I'll have a question. I'll get James to, kickstart. How about that? So James, just as usual, I think a lot of people that are joining this call today is probably transitioning or working in a startup environment. How was your experience transitioning into UX, and how did that happen? What's your background?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting one. I love, firstly, thank you. Like, I love being part of your class last year. As you'll know, like, please don't be afraid to ask questions. I think I'm going to be as super honest and transparent as I can be. And it probably starts here, right? Which is my background is not as a product designer. My background is not in UX. So when I started out of college, I did a Bachelor of Digital Media, and I thought that I was going to be I was going to create films. I love creating videos, and I came out of uni at the financial crisis, and no jobs. And so I kind of took the first thing that kind of came to my path, and that was as a motion designer. And luckily, being doing digital media, I got exposed to so many bits of the craft that I was able to pick it up, and then spent probably 6 years of my career doing motion design and motion graphics, and was in a lot of bespoke kind of studios to a point where loved it. Got exposed to so many different things, stakeholder management, working with different companies and agencies, learning how the trades of negotiating worked, learning how to make the right trade-offs. And those are kind of the tools that, for anyone transitioning into a different field, every step of the way, you're going to pick up skills that are going to translate into what you're doing. And then as I spent 5 years, I kind of was in small agencies to a point where I thought, actually, what does that big old company look like? And I thought I'd get myself out of where I was, give it a go, and ended up at Seven West Media, which is a broadcasting studio for TV, leading one of the digital spaces. And it was my first foray into it, and then realized absolutely hated working at a massive company because there's so much red tape. There's so little impact that you can have as an individual. You have to get so many levels of support and advice from other people in order to make any decisions. And probably the best decision that I've ever made, that I actually didn't make, but I got made redundant from there. And the job after that was Airtasker. And I was a brand designer, and I got hired as a brand designer at Airtasker, a senior brand designer, and I was there for a year doing brand design, and moved into the digital space, moved into UX and UI, and learned it from that point onwards, and was just exposed to it at work at Airtasker, to so many talented designers, to a point where arguably I'm not a great product designer. I'll admit that first and foremost. But I'm a heck of a good manager, which I think is good. And I've picked up a lot, and I think that for me has been the transition. So, reaching out to the community, reaching out and asking those questions, which is why like I'd love to kind of be on these and give back, to kind of give back a lot of my experience, what I've learned, what I've heard, what I've seen in the industry, share it back as openly and honestly as possible. But that's kind of been my transition. It's probably not the most natural one. It's probably not the most common either. But it also hopefully gives everyone that little bit of hope, which is, it doesn't really matter how long you've been in the craft, as long as you have the right level of thinking, the right critical mindset, understand what the craft is, and don't overthink it, don't overcomplicate it, and then build the right connections, you can be successful. You just need to know what your strengths are and leverage off that. So that's probably a sharing that I probably haven't shared with that many people. I was pretty embarrassed about it. Like the first time I got made the VP of design at Airtasker, I was like, oh, I'm gonna head up like the product design function and the brand side and the research side. And my experience probably doesn't stack up against some of these others, but it's something that I've actually learned, that it's actually really good to bring a different perspective into these roles, because you can have a level of impact with whatever you're doing. And yeah, it's hopefully a way to inspire all of you to not give up and to just keep going on.
I love it. And then when you were mentioning about the Yeah, I can definitely resonate with you because right now I'm like too old to learn all of these like Figma updates every single week. It's like there's 3 different updates. I'm like, I don't know what's happening. And yeah, so when you mentioned about transitioning into manager and all the different mindsets and soft skills, what does it take for someone who is in a pool of designers and then for you to become that person that's right for the management position?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Um, I think a lot of it for me is to be a really good manager, you actually really need to be quite selfless. You have to want to care for other people. I think what I've realized is as a manager, you ultimately hold in your hands the careers and the lives of the people that you manage. And if you don't understand that responsibility, you're probably not going to take it seriously enough. um, Once you realize the magnitude that any decision and the feedback that you provide, how you grow and nurture someone is going to have a severe impact on how they progress in their careers, I think it does give you a reality check. So I think that's probably the first thing. I think the other things is empathy. You absolutely need to understand. And that's what I think makes, surprisingly, like, for designers, there's probably 2 spectrums. There's a spectrum that really likes designing, and so that's the technical path. And then there's the other, which is they've got really good empathy, they've got great communication, they love collaborating, and so they are going to probably be good managers on that because they've got the right tools. They've honed it quite well. They've got great questioning skills, right? So when you go through and you do research and you do interviews, you're really tapping into that art of interviewing and question asking. And if you can utilize that into your one-on-ones with your peers or your reports, it's really powerful because then you start to understand, like, what do they want to do in their careers? Are they really enjoying it? Can you identify areas of improvement? And you really go down that kind of coaching path. Um, but I think that's pretty much it that I've identified, at least for myself, and everyone might be different. But I think there's commonalities there, which I think is really good communication skills, and really strong empathy, um, and a need to empower your teams. I think having the trust and ability to grow your team the right way with the right level of transparency and honesty, and guidance is probably the other piece where, yeah, you just don't want to be the person who's overbearing within that team as a manager.
Oops. Okay. So just on that, I'm sure you have worked with many introverts, right? Because just
Yeah.
then you were focusing on the point of great communication skills, people skills, all of that. How would you suggest, what suggestion would you give for introvert designers to start showing that they have the people skill without being really uncomfortable? I'm sure you've worked with introverts before.
Interesting question, because I guess inherently I think of myself as an introvert because I think there's differences, right? Like, I don't feel that I am the most outwardly energetic person in the world. And I don't think you need to be. I also don't think that I am the one who spends the most time talking in a lot of these meetings that I'm in, because I don't think that's what communication is. Communication isn't the loudest voice. Communication isn't the one who speaks the longest or the most or has the most opinions. Communication is actually, if you break it down, is active listening. So if you actively listen and you take your time to understand, which is the empathy part, and you pull that together, you only need to say a few things per meeting to have the level of impact. You're also not there to have your idea heard first and foremost. You're actually there to share a perspective. And I think that's what lends itself to be great, regardless of if you're introverted or not. Because ultimately you're there to guide other people through. And I think introverts are really great active listeners. They spend so much of their time trying to understand processing a lot internally. I think the one thing that I'd probably say is, as you're processing it, feel free to don't overthink it in your mind. I think a lot of the time introverts spend a lot of their time thinking up there, and that's great, but it often leads them to lose the moment. And so time passes them by and they're still formulating how to best articulate what they want to say. And sometimes you don't need to. You just need to push yourself to go, actually, it's more important that I put out my perspective out there. It doesn't matter if it's articulated perfectly or not at first. And if it's not, great, I'll learn from it. But I think that's the other piece, is you have to be really open to feedback, and open to growing yourself, because that's how you will start to develop, is just challenging yourself. You don't have to go from step 1 all the way to 100. It's kind of, if you say nothing for five meetings, then you start writing down some notes and go, actually, like, this is what I wanted to say. Great, right? That's the first step, is that you're forming your own opinions. You're really starting to understand. And then the next step is challenging yourself. So the next time it happens, can you say one of those things that you've written down? If you can do that, that's perfect, right? So it's a step by step. And I think a lot of the times we identify these areas of improvement and we want to go from like 1 all the way to perfect. And realistically, we should just kind of break it down into different steps and go, actually, we just need to go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2. And that makes it much less daunting. And that's the same for anything, right?
For sure. Okay, I think I've asked enough questions. Does anyone else want to jump in? Yes. There we go, Vinay.
Hey.
Sorry if I pronounce your name wrong. Sorry.
It's Vinay. Yeah, that's okay. Right. First of all, thanks, Jaslyn and James, for supporting us with your time. So my question for James would be like, how do you actually get to know or realize that you're ready to move on to a next level when you are in any point in your career, like the point where you get to know that, okay, I think probably I should just now take up the next step and move on to the next role. How do you realize that, or do you just take a leap of faith and start trying out if that works it out, or how could we do that?
I would, just to clarify, would this be a new role within the same industry, or in your mind, is it more the transition between one industry to another? Say, for instance, like going from brand design into product design, or engineering into design, or is it more kind of the change from levels, being like a mid-level designer to senior designer, or senior designer to a manager?
Yes, I think the last one would actually be the one that I was actually thinking about.
Cool. I'll be honest, when I was asked to be a manager, I didn't think I was ready. And I think this is, when I read up about it, the majority of it is like, you do need to find people who actually care about you, which is why the role of a manager is just so important, because so often we don't see our own strengths well enough. Every time you have a performance review, everyone will kind of identify and kind of sink their teeth into the key areas of improvement. And they often forget to reinforce your strengths. And the strength is actually the thing which will help propel you through the rest of your career. Everyone's got a full set of strengths that they can keep leveraging off. And often we kind of forget some of those things. So for me, I always knew that I had good empathy. I always knew that I could communicate quite well. But along the way, I just forgot that it was just so natural that I didn't see it as a strength. I just saw it as, okay, like, that's just who I am. And it wasn't until the past VP at Airtasker, who was my manager, essentially had these talks with me and was like, I'm seeing these things in you that I was just taking for granted. And I think the best thing that we can do is either reach out and have those chats. Hopefully you have a manager who really does care for you and can see those and is highlighting those areas for you. And if not, definitely ask them for what they see as your key strengths. And also keep reflecting. I think the most important things that I've seen from everyone that I've managed, and the ones I see the most potential in, are the ones that are incredibly self-reflective. They spend the time looking back on themselves. What have they learned? Where have they grown? What do they need to grow into? I think the caveat there is that also the most self-reflective people are also the most critical, self-critical. They're so hard on themselves that's why they also do need a manager to pull them out of that rut, to say, actually, it's great that you can identify these areas as your strengths, but also you're being incredibly hard on yourself in these areas. But I would say it's really hard, and this probably isn't the best answer for you, is that it's really hard to know when you are ready, because unless you've, and actually what I would say is, and what I've been trying to talk to some of the senior people in my team who don't know if they want to be a manager or not, is to have some of these conversations in regards to, what do you want to achieve in your career? What motivates you? What are you inspired to do? What are you motivated by? But also giving you opportunities. So being a manager is quite selfless, as I mentioned. So spending the time either mentoring, finding a mentor, spending that time with someone, or being able to identify areas of improvement, of development within another designer within your team who might be younger, not as experienced, and really fostering that will give you an idea as to, do you actually enjoy doing that? Because I will tell you now, I spend maybe 5%, maybe less on tools. And that's on visuals, on the visual side. I spend the majority of my time on organizational work, or on business docs, or on providing feedback, writing L&D progression plans for people, doing performance management. Like, that is essentially what I do day in and day out. And so that's kind of the end spectrum where you're in the leadership team. So if you're a design manager, hopefully you probably don't have as much of those business stocks to write, and you'd still get probably like 50% or maybe 30%. But if you become a manager, you're essentially spending your time first and foremost managing people, and secondary, if you get the time, is actual design work. So that's probably the key distinction to kind of make there.
Thanks, James. I think that was actually the other question that I wanted to just check with you, if I may, just want to check also about once you move up to that level of a senior manager or a VP as you are. Do you still have that itch to go back to the ground level and get your hands dirty and get into the design work? And if at all that is the case, how do you manage it?
Yeah, fantastic question. That's probably the one challenge that absolutely everyone who becomes a first-time manager struggles with, to the point where they can't let go of being an individual contributor. A lot of it, I feel, is trust, and being able to have the trust in your team. So a lot of the times, if you reflect on why do you want to get back on it, often it's not because you really want to, and sometimes it is, in which case you should really kind of question whether you want to be a manager, or whether you really wanted to take down a technical mastery path and just getting better and better at the tools. But the other one is probably trust, where you don't have the trust in your team, or you don't have the experienced team in order to deliver on what you want to see from them. And so often you will gravitate back to, it's just easy if I do it myself. And that's probably the wrong level of thinking to go back to, which is actually spend the time in multiplying yourself through really training others in order to make the right decisions and to think in the right way, so that ultimately you don't need to do that anymore. I don't necessarily, like, I've got a small team, so I've got a team of 5 product designers. And so when required, I do use the tools in order to support. But I thought that I was going to miss it a whole lot more than I do. And I'll be honest, I actually really enjoy having these conversations with my product designers and seeing the impact through them versus myself actually having to do that myself. And I think that's the sign. I think my manager asked me very early on, like, is this what you want to do? And I think I thought about it for a while, and I think actually, yeah, like I'm actually loving managing this team and building these connections and seeing them grow. And ultimately, that's been a greater reward than any of my individual contributing in the past. But the call out for you is that design is very much immediate reward. Right? So you get a brief, you do the work, you see something visual pretty much immediately. In regards to testing it as a product feature, you probably don't see that as immediate, and so that's longer term. But when you manage a team and you provide some level of advice to someone, you probably won't see that change happen for 6 months. And so that's probably the other reason why so many people turn back to individual contributing work, because there's such an immediate dopamine hit to going, there is something that I've just done that has contributed and I can see it. And I'm so happy to see this level of impact that I've had. And once you kind of train your mind to not seek that out as often, or finding like other areas to do that, yeah, it makes it easier and easier as you go. Hopefully that kind of helps. Yeah.
That did. Thanks, James. Thanks.
James, I think I was knocking my head so much that my neck hurts now. There were so much points in that conversation alone. Like last year, we briefly chatted about after the class Q&A, you and I chatted about the importance of self-reflection. And I just really wanted to touch on this point before the next question, Tanisha. And so that self-reflection part is super important, because as human, right, we're constantly, especially designer, we're constantly living in that job description of providing value for clients, providing value for the company that we work for, user that we work for. So we're constantly looking outwards. And it's so important to sometimes just turn your lens inwards and then do some sort of self-reflection. And there's tons of tools out there allows you to just, you can spend an hour, a month, an hour, 6 months, whatever it is. But I couldn't agree more that the more a person, not just designer, anybody, right, in any industry, the more a person reflect on themselves and be able to draw out the milestones in their own roadmap. So you are a product. How are you going to achieve to that next stage? And that towards your final goal is extremely important. And I know it's super unnatural, as James mentioned, it's super unnatural to emphasize our strength. But you know what? There is a trick. Let me tell you a little trick. So I have this little trick. Whenever, every 2 years or something, I probably redesign my website, which I haven't actually touched for like 5 years. But like sometimes if I have a pitch deck or something, so I would redesign my pitch deck. So well, okay, I feel like a new person. I'm going to redesign it, right? So what I do is I have a type form of 7 questions asking, and I send out to my Facebook friends. So anybody can reply. And these questions were like, if you can describe me in 3 words, what would you describe me as? What's the quality that you can always count on me for? Describe, you know. And then you can ask fun questions such as, you know, if you can use 2 colors to label me as a person, what are those 2 colors? So this is my little Q&A to get a reflection from what the world sees me. And then I utilize that little Q&A to design myself as a brand. And I think everybody can use this little tactic. And it really is so rewarding. I mean, you make it anonymous, of course, because if people know that their names out there, they might be biased. So you make them anonymous, and then when you read them, it's actually really refreshing. It's almost like a third person. It's like a movie character. Oh, another question I have is, if you can name me with a movie character, which movie character would you label? And it's so interesting. So I would suggest, you know, everybody give it a go. And that potentially it's your asset to be able to, you know, you can implement and then tell people stories about you. This is what people say about me. I didn't say this about me. Other people say that about me. It's like a nice little bridge. Anyway, I'm sure Tanisha can't wait to, Tanisha is putting her hand up for about the last 15 minutes. Sorry, love. It's your turn.
Hi, no problem. I just wanted to ask James, do you have any tips on giving and receiving feedback, both as somebody in a junior role and then now in a more senior managerial role?
Yeah, great question. Also very relatable because we've just gone through 360-degree feedback at Airtasker. So feedback's so critical, regardless of what role you're in. And I think the better we get at receiving feedback as early as possible, the better. I think we need to see feedback as a gift. Like that's probably the biggest thing, where you can't take it personally. Not everyone's going to be great at giving feedback, but I think what everyone's able to do is hopefully able to filter through that feedback. So you're able to kind of see what the intent is, and that's probably the biggest thing. Is if you're going to give feedback, please have positive intent. Check yourself on it. Ask yourself why do you want to give this feedback? Is it for your own good? If it's for your own good and it's not there to really make the other person better, you probably shouldn't give it in that light. That's probably the biggest thing as a feedback giver, is really make sure that you have positive intent there, because everyone can see through it, regardless of if you frame it in the best positive light, but you have a hidden intent there. People will start to see through that. Make sure that you know your facts as well. I think when you're giving feedback, a lot of the times there's things in there that you're going to assume. And often our minds are so powerful that they can tell us stories that you're seeing something that doesn't quite exist, or you're observing a behavior that doesn't exist, or you're seeing something in the work that isn't backed off anything. So if you're going to give feedback in regards to design, make sure it's not subjective. And it's as objective as possible. So make sure you understand what the problem is that is to be solved, who the customer is, what the audience is, are there any data points, what's causing them to make that decision. The more objective you are, the less it is an opinion and more of this is what is in the best interest of the customer, for instance. And then when you're receiving feedback, you just need to take it all on. Have your arms open and just go give it to me. I think the one thing that I definitely look for within like junior designers is just the ability to seek it, to be super hungry for feedback. And then they won't be able to filter it. And I don't expect a junior designer to necessarily filter through the feedback, but I think that's where a more senior designer will help you out, where they will show you what it actually means, what the feedback, how do you interpret it, how do you actually bring it back into your own work, how do you actually action on it. And I think that's kind of the biggest things for me. As a more senior member of the team, I think the biggest and hardest thing is, even if you have the right intent for the feedback, making sure that it doesn't come across as a directive is probably one of the hardest things to do, where there is a really thin line there where if you say something, it can very easily be taken as, oh, like they've said this and they are a lot higher up than me and I just need to do this. If you're on the receiving end of something like that, don't do that, please. Just question it and really ask yourself, this is what they said. How does this impact the problem that we're trying to resolve? Because a lot of the times it's not directive. It's just there to ask a question. It's just there to be a question to understand and to further clarify what's happening. And also, as a senior member, I love getting feedback from my reports or other people in the business. It doesn't happen as often as I would like. I hope that I'm good at creating psychological safety within the team. once I get my feedback, I'll probably be able to validate that or invalidate that to you all. But I just don't get it enough. And so regardless of how junior you are, I think everyone has an ability to provide feedback and to observe. And I'd encourage that. Don't be scared of it. As I said, like as long as the intent is there, there's no bad feedback. Everyone, as much as you don't think it, is actually craving for feedback. If you kind of think about yourself and you go, have you received enough feedback in the year? I think the majority of us would go, probably not. And so if we open ourselves to it and encourage it, I think we'll all be better for it. We'll help each other succeed that much faster as a result of getting that feedback. So hopefully, yeah, you all go out there and you know, tell, you know, the person who's sitting next to you one or two things that they've been doing well, or constructive feedback, the things that you've probably gone, actually, like, there's a thing that that person always does, and I've just never felt confident about telling them. If you care about them, definitely tell them, because they're not going to know otherwise.
It's really about how you bring it up, and just be like, if you're hot-headed, just let it sit for a while, I guess. That's always if you're not feeling calm, just don't send the email, don't say anything, let it sit for a while, sleep on it, and then, you know, carry it out in a more mature manner, I suppose. Yeah. Tanisha, did it answer your question, or do you have any follow-up questions?
No, it did answer my question, I guess. Yeah, for me, I think the biggest thing I have to work on is to filter through the feedback and how to implement it, because I often find myself taking feedback as directive. So that was a great point. Thank you.
Yeah. Sometimes I think it's important to know, in terms of, because James briefly mentioned the psychological safety environment, and it's just, your team is so blessed because you're considering them in that sense all the time, being empathetic. But in a lot of the time, let's say if some designers could potentially join a team, and let's say in the startup environment, and there is only, let's say if it's only you in that product team, and you have all these stakeholders like sales guys, marketing guys, tech guys, everyone is trying to give you feedback. At that time, I would say that you would have to really be strong and stand still. And that is actually the best practice sometimes, to train up how you bring up valid points and consolidate with your design, with your research data, to represent it back to the wider team so that they can understand where you're coming from. But at the same time, you really need to empathize with what they need in order to get their job done. But in a situation, if you feel really uncomfortable or being pushed to do things that you don't really want to, I would encourage you to stand up for yourself and ask why. Because if you just keep taking the order from, let's say, CEO or something, who's probably, you know, empathize with them, they don't really understand how you work and how you prefer to work. So it's probably much better if you just stop them from giving the feedback if you don't think it's helpful, and then explain to them, communicate to them. That's the only way you guys can create a better working relationship going forward. And I can tell you, there are a lot of startup CEO out there, they have no idea how to brief or feedback people. So unless you have James as that shelter, you will have to be your own shelter. So you have to be strong. All right, anyone else got questions?
Hi, Jacqueline. Reshma this side. I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question, hi, James. My question is basically around getting a breakthrough in the design industry in Sydney or in Australia. So I am a migrant, and I've moved to Australia last year. So as an overseas experienced designer, there are a couple of challenges which I am facing while during my job search journey. So one of them is around the skill sets which is required for the roles which are in the market. So I have observed that most of the roles are around the UX, UI skills. And like my past experience in both my organization has been only as a UX designer, because the team was structured in a way where there were visual designers or UI designers who would, take the handover from the deliverables that we worked on. So how can I work on that aspect is my first question. And the other aspect was, how do I, because I'm very new to the industry, how do I identify companies or teams who kind of have this divide as UX designers and UI designer skills within their team? So I'm sure even in Sydney, there are teams. A few of them I know is like the Woolworths team and, bigger organizations. However, in smaller organizations, it usually is an expectation that you kind of know a lot of skills, like right from research to development. So how does one even, get to know about these teams? So two parts to that question. Yeah.
Man, loaded question. The first part, it's tricky. So Airtasker, for instance, you're right. Like I've got 5 product designers, ranging from junior. I've got junior designer, level 2 designer, senior designer, and a staff designer. So I've got the full spectrum. I'm missing a principal, but I've got the full spectrum. We used to have a split, and now we've moved towards a generalized product designer requirement. And I think a lot of that is in relation to what the company needs. Each of those product designers, regardless of their level, are actually leaning more to one side. I've got one product designer who, very similar to you, she came into Airtasker as a UX researcher, as an intern, and recently moved into a product designer role. Phenomenal product designer, but executional skills, needs work. Absolutely fine. I'm happy to do that. But from a thinking perspective, from a problem analysis perspective, killer. Absolutely great. And so from a UX perspective, you have so many strengths. And I don't like, I know like I'll probably harp on this a lot in this session, but I think it's something that I'm starting to really understand a little bit more in regards to, there's so many things that people are going to tell you that you need to keep improving on, but there's going to be so many things that you currently do as a UX designer that are your strengths that you can leverage off, that will inform and make sure that you have to make as little a leap as possible to the UI front. There's going to be the executional side, but so much of what you can do from a UX side and understanding the problem, understanding the right direction, ideating and thinking of how to solve customer needs, how to actually go through that customer journey and understand all the different emotions that customers are going through, and to validate that, you need to leverage it. But I think the biggest thing is potentially like push yourself a little bit, meet the right people in regards to from the UI side, whether in your own company or people outside in the design industry. I think the design industry is opening up to the point where we all want to meet each other. We all want to share our experiences, and absolutely, like work with them. Say, hey, like this is what I can do. You might be able to share your experiences from a UX design side, and there might be someone who's really great at the UI, but is also facing the same problem and is wanting to become a generalist product designer who needs to actually learn more from the UX side. And you might be able to share those skills. Jacqueline might be able to do a GA course in regards to the UX side, the UI side, in which case, definitely go along to that. But it really depends also, like you need to also ask yourself whether you care about the UI side, because it's one thing for the industry to move towards it. And I think the industry is moving towards it. Just there's a divide because one, businesses can't afford sometimes to have both. And so they do make those trade-offs. But if your interests aren't in the UI side, then it probably won't be what's going to make you happy in the industry. So definitely ask yourself that question first and foremost. in regards to kind of defining the split between UI and UX in regards to companies, I would probably say that the majority of the smaller ones are going to be more generalized, at least in Sydney. And the larger organizations where you probably are looking at, larger doesn't necessarily mean like 50 product designers. Larger is probably more towards like 10, 15, or 10 to 20 product designers. They probably have a split. So I think Zip have a split in theirs where they have UX researchers, UI and UX designers. The majority that I know, like the bigger ones, Canva definitely has a split, Atlassian has a split. I think Koala has generalized. I think Prosper has generalized. So some of those smaller companies. But at the same time, I think there are smaller companies. I think ShipIt has splits, so UX and UI. They just have less of them. So they have maybe one UX and one UI designer and a lead. And so that's also the distinction. So you either go for numbers, and it depends on how big the initiatives are, what their initiatives required are. But there's no easy way to tell, unfortunately.
Right.
I think the best way is probably just to reach out to different people in the industry and just to ask the question. I think what you've done now is perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Sorry, it's not a foolproof answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's all right. I just need to get your thoughts on that. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's another thing, going back to that self-reflection part. It's you don't want to change yourself for the job. You need the job to go with what you want. It's super important. You are the center point. So please don't force yourself into a square that doesn't fit your circle. And keep self-reflecting. What do you love? What do you love to do? And find companies that suit that, because otherwise you'll be spending your time looking for companies that's probably not going to hire you because you're not that specific person that they're looking for, and it would disencourage you in the long run. So I think one thing I want to say is trust your guts. They're given to you for a reason. Yeah, okay. Any more questions? If not, I've got one. No, okay, I got one. James, my question is on process. So that's my forever struggle in every company because it seems like, because I don't work in a very large enterprise and I don't just come in and blend into the big pie chart. But so a lot of the times I'm like helping the company trying to figure out what's the best process. And that means I need to reach out to different people in the industry and ask them, what do they think the best process works for their team? And I understand every team is different. But in general, if you guys were going to create a new feature for the product, so let's say you're looking at the roadmap and let's say the product manager or product lead had put the roadmap together, you guys work towards the roadmap. When the next feature comes along, could you explain the process from low-fi to high-fi?
Yeah. So a lot of our time is spent in discovery. So really trying to understand what's actually going on, what that feature needs to adopt, what that feature needs to actually address. From a design side, a lot of the time for a product designer is really immersing themselves within that problem space, speaking to customers as much as possible. One of the things that I'm absolutely loving from one of our product designers and product teams is rapid prototyping. So they do the prototype of the day, love that, to the point where they're really biasing progress over perfection. And I think that's really key, is that at the very initial stage, as you mentioned, there is probably a difference, right? So a lot of our product designers don't sketch anymore. They don't really do lo-fi wireframes. And a lot of the reason, and I'm not promoting it, the only reason why is a lot of the times we have a design system. And so a lot of the times it's easier to pull components from a design system than it is to just draw a wireframe box. That said, please go through and do wireframes. If you don't have a design system, don't do high fidelity components when you don't need to. I'm not 100% sold on still, because I still feel that even utilizing design system components does box your ideation in, and doesn't allow for that divergent thinking as much as you would intend it to. I think the way to mitigate that, however, is collaboration. So you do an ideation workshop with multiple perspectives and multiple people. But that's probably what happens at the start of our sessions, which is discovery, immersing yourself within that problem space, understanding what needs to be done, what the customer journey is, what the flows are, what the metrics for success should look like. And then on the back of that, we start to identify some ideation. And so that would be like wireframes, prototypes, and then we test that really quickly and rapidly. So either that's bringing in our own customers or guerrilla testing within the office, and making sure that, okay, like, is this, do people understand what this concept is actually about? Do they actually know what it's trying to solve? Doing some usability testing. I think the one thing that we're learning about usability testing is great for testing how usable it is, not very good at testing the value that it generates. And so the earlier that you can actually put that product out there into the wild and actually put it in front of customers in the real world where they have an actual decision to make on whether they want to use it or not use it, that's more valuable than spending countless hours doing usability testing. It's great for kind of surfacing some of the core issues, making sure, but you're never going to get to 100%. And if you kind of spend all your time in that testing phase, you probably spend a lot of time in that space without really knowing whether it's adding any value to your customers, because as we all know, customers can tell you one thing, and often it's what they think you want to hear, but not necessarily what's actually going on in their minds, and not necessarily a reflection of what they would actually do when they have to either fork out some money, spend some time on it. And so that's really critical for us. But a lot of that space in between it is testing. So we've got design critiques where our design team comes together, you present your ideas in there, and you get feedback from multiple different perspectives from other product designers that aren't within your team. And that's the most important thing to kind of bring back to your product team and go, okay, we're out of that bubble that we're in and day out. And then constantly iterating and testing. That's probably our design process in a nutshell. Just keeping track of the metrics, making sure that we've got our tracking correct. That's probably the one thing that you need to make sure you do, is once you put it out there, make sure you're tracking the right stuff. There's been so many times that we've probably made the error of tracking or under tracking, and when you do that, you just don't get enough insights, and you almost need to do it again. So making sure that you go through and run through that process to give you the level of insights that you need to make the right decisions, to iterate on it. That's probably what we end up doing. It's pretty stock standard, I think, but it works for us. The one thing that I'm probably trying to promote more internally is collaboration. And hopefully something for everyone else to kind of take out there is, yeah, really break down those silos in your companies. It doesn't help anyone being siloed and making siloed decisions as a product team or as a product owner. So the more that you can bring other people within the business and the right stakeholders into those discussions, the better. And the earlier you do it, the better. But yeah, that's probably the one thing that I'm trying to see if we can keep promoting.
Oh, I love it, but my challenge is always the developers is not doing what, and I'm like, sometimes. But it's like these kind of things sometimes takes a long process, and I think just like you said, communications and collaborations, and which is why I asked the question, how do you motivate introverts to communicate, because I'm here, I'm like, developers, talk to me, I'm here every day, I'm waiting, and they're like, oh, we're fine. And then at the end the thing comes up, I'm like, oh, it's not really right.
Yeah, I think in that regard, I think you're right. Like, I think sometimes when you ask the question, this also comes back to, as a manager, when you ask your report, you go, I would like some feedback. It's so open-ended. And so they don't know what to give you feedback on. They don't know what you're responsible, what you're accountable for, and they don't really have any guidance to provide you that feedback. And so it's the same. So when you go back to your engineer and you go, do you have any feedback, or do you have anything to say about this? It's so open-ended that I think what we can do is we can guide that discussion for introverts, which is be really pointed in what feedback you are looking for. Be quite specific about what that piece is. If you don't know what it is, provide what the context of it is, and allow them to start thinking through and being empowered to think through a problem. I think sometimes we often do a lot of that thinking for them. We don't bring them on that journey. And so when you're not bringing them on their journey, they don't actually feel empowered to be part of that journey either. And so the more that we bring them into those conversations, sharing those insights, sharing those user interviews with them, sharing those problem statements really early on in that process. And that's probably the one thing that we do well at Airtasker, is bringing our engineers in the process incredibly early, and something we've learned from past experiences. That's allowed a lot of the engineers to really start taking an interest in the products that we're creating. And they've got such good insights. Like, you need to tap into that, because they're really good thinkers. They're really good critical thinkers. They actually really care about the user experience. And the more that we can tap into it, the better ultimately.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's the challenge for me is how might I motivate them to speak out a little bit more, and not be afraid, because sometimes they're like, oh, they're trying to like go sideways in terms of like trying to, when they're commenting on the design, no matter how much I go, just throw it out there, I'm bulletproof. I don't care. And they're still, they're trying to be nice, but I guess this will grow with time. So yay, thank you, James. It's a little bit over 6 now, and it's just, I've learned so much, and I'm sure everyone else has too. And it's so good to see familiar faces like Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Jacqueline.
Thank you.
I was considering telling the story of James and me, but maybe this is not the right time.
Next time, I would love to know.
Awesome.
Yeah.
You can tell me again, Mike.
Yeah, I will do.
Coolio. All right. Thank you guys, and I will see you soon. Oh, actually,
thanks everyone.
James, how would everyone, like, if they have further questions, how do they find you?
LinkedIn is the obvious way. Yeah. I think quite a few people reached out the last time from your GA talk, which was absolutely brilliant. Definitely, find me on LinkedIn, send me a request, and ask questions in there. And apologies if I don't get to you within the week, but I will definitely respond, and I'll get back to you, I promise.
Sweet. Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone, and have a great week.